Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's OAAA Lunch Break. I'm Stephen Freitas with OAAA. Today is part two of a great series that we're hosting this week on programmatic. Today, we're going to be discussing programmatic transactions. And with us today are Christina Radigan, who is the Media Director and Marketing and Communications for OMG, Dave Etherington, the COO for Place Exchange, and Stephanie Gutnick, who's a consultant on digital transformation with Outfront Media. Now, before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping topics today. We welcome your questions through the webinar, so please feel free to submit them using the Zoom question bar. And if we aren't able to get to your questions, we will follow up with you individually after the webinar. And all of our webinars are featured on our website under the webinar library. And today's recording will be available later today. So now I'm going to turn it over to the panel. Christina, Stephanie, Dave, it's all yours.
Thanks, Stephen, and very excited to be with everybody today. As Stephen mentioned, this is a part two, so some of the more basics of programmatic were covered on Tuesday. And we can definitely touch upon those as we go further into what this means for your company, whether you are a publisher or media owner, an agency, or a tech platform. And hopefully there's some brands on the line too who might have some questions about what this means for their strategy. So Christina, I'll let you take it away.
Great, thank you. So to kind of reiterate what we determined in webinar one is really how we define programmatic. And it's essentially the automated, data-driven buying and selling of digital out-of-home advertising. So programmatic actually enhances out-of-home's value proposition as a reach medium, but it also enhances flexibility and targetability through audience-driven approach at the point of location, all powered by context. So I was asked today to join the Innovations Committee to give an agency perspective on how we look at and buy digital out of home, whether it be through direct or programmatic transactions. Agencies essentially develop guidelines and guardrails for how we evaluate digital out of home. We actually call these playbooks. And we, develop a bunch of criteria that we use to vet, analyze, value digital out of home, but ultimately it helps us to decide how we're going to transact, whether it be through programmatic or direct insertion order. Can advance to the next slide. Thank you. So every agency, every brand will probably have its own decision tree on helping us to arrive at whether or not we are going to use a programmatic transaction or direct transaction. And one thing I just want to point out here is that we actually don't view programmatic as a channel in and of itself, but actually a transaction type. So while again, they all might be different, there are definitely things that I think we all align on. So for programmatic transaction, and typically if data is going to drive our site selection, if there's a requirement for flexibility in day parting or mid-campaign optimization, and if there's a campaign pause that is anticipated, then we would ultimately buy through a programmatic transaction. However, direct transaction, which ultimately will always have a place in digital out-of-home and out-of-home buying for sure, specifically when there's a specific site, which we tend to call cherry picking. And then also if there are GRP or reach goals, we actually can't arrive at these metrics buying programmatically. So for these types of needs and requirements, we would use a direct transaction. And then of course, if there's no pause anticipated or needed, oftentimes a brand wants a consistent presence in the marketplace. So in terms of DSPs or demand side platforms, in order for us to activate programmatically at all, we need to have access to this type of platform. So there are two primary types of DSPs. There's the channel focused DSP and the omni-channel DSP. With the programmatic digital out-of-home DSP, we're essentially focused on looking at networks, digital out-of-home networks, and having the ability to activate across all different networks, all different sellers. And they're actually serve a great purpose specifically for out-of-home specialists. And again, these types of single channel focused DSPs really actually have exceptional targeting capabilities because they've been developed and customized specifically for that channel. And then of course, you've got the omni-channel focused DSPs, which allow you to take money and spread it across multiple channels, whether it be mobile, desktop, social, TV, radio. And it also gives us the ability to arrive at, cross-channel measurement and attribution. And I'd like to call out that Dave's going to actually weigh in on this a little later and apply the sort of the similarities and the differences as it pertains to buy types. So regardless of DSP type that you choose, there are definitely some certain must-haves. And that's basically the ability to buy transparently and have centralized workflow. But ultimately, it's also the ability to have access to data and supply. From a data perspective, we're going to look at a DSP to bring us the ability to access valuable data, like audience data. And then also, several agencies like to use a BYOD model, which is really bring your own data opportunity, where we can actually have the DSP import an audience segment. But ultimately, whether we use the DSP's data that's provided from a third party or our own data, it gives us the ability to have a standardized approach of indexing all out-of-home inventory against a specific audience segment. And then, of course, supply. From a supply standpoint, it's really important that the DSP has integrations with the supply that we need and that we want at scale. And I'm happy to say within the last several months, I've seen a lot more scale be added to the SSP. And again, from when we consider any type of targeting in the physical world, we're really hung up on audience right now, as we should be. It's definitely game changing for digital out of home, and certainly for programmatic. But physical world targeting actually really requires that we have the ability through the DSP to do weather triggering, proximity targeting, day parting, week parting, and even by venue type. So we might actually determine to buy against gyms or office buildings, but it gives us the opportunity to spread the money across those specific networks and sellers. We have learned through Programmatic Transaction that about 50% of all of our programmatic transactions require proximity targeting. So at this point, I'm actually going to hand it over to Stephanie, who's going to walk us through the different types of programmatic buy types.
Thanks, Christina. And let's just move on to the next slide, please. So one of the biggest conversations that I'll have with teams at the publisher side or even on the buy side is reminding everyone that this word programmatic, Christina gave a great definition at the beginning, but it is in itself a transaction type. And there's so much that goes into programmatic conversations and readiness that sometimes we forget. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is just a way to allow buyers to get to the inventory of sellers. What complicates things, of course, is that there are a few different transaction types within the overall transaction that is a programmatic deal. And you're looking at them right now. One is the open auction or an exchange. Another one is private marketplace deals, or PMPs, as you'll often hear. And then finally, we have guaranteed. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with guaranteed because that's the easiest for both parts of the deal to really understand, as it very much mimics a direct IO or a contract that we are very used to transacting out of home on to date. And so guaranteed deals mean that the buyer is going to buy a certain number of impressions or screens, depending on how they want to go about it. But in the programmatic space, it's typically impressions at a certain cost. So in programmatic, we price based on CPM, which is cost per thousand. And overall, the buyer will know how much, based on the start date and the end date of the flight, is going to be generated in terms of impressions and cost. And the reasons for doing this programmatically are to include out of home in these omni-channel DSPs that Christina had mentioned and Dave will chat about. So out of home sits within the rest of the media buy. And also just to make sure that certain locations are very much involved in the campaign. It's guaranteed. So it's guaranteed to play on the selected screens during the flight time. And why I am emphasizing this, because that sounds pretty normal to a lot of us on the call, is if we go to the next slide, we start looking at non-guaranteed deals. And this is how the bulk of programmatic transactions actually take place in the media landscape and in out-of-home. So in non-guaranteed, it really just means that an ad is going to be programmatically inserted on the publisher side if there is space available. And the decisioning process happens the very last minute in real time, hence why you will often hear the term real-time bidding. That's just different buyers bidding in real time on the same spot that is available on the publisher side. And so there are, of course, a few flavors of non-guaranteed, and open auction is one of the most popular. Well, that's how this all started over 10 years ago in the digital space, is really when there is a spot that's available, the buyer is going to place their bid. They don't really know where or when it's going to go, mind you, and there's going to be some bidding on that. The highest buyer wins, the spot gets inserted. It's kind of like the stock market. If we move to the next slide, however, we will see the difference between the exchange and private marketplace deals. Private marketplace deals are more tailored than the exchange. Now, the exchange kind of gathered a bad rap back in the day because it was deemed a black box. The buyer didn't really know much about what was going on and where their ad was playing until after the fact. This has changed a lot in recent times in the digital world, and out-of-home has been able to apply those best practices, because now in the exchange, buyers do have the opportunity often to see who the publisher is and what pricing kind of tends to look like. And they're given a lot more information, but that doesn't compensate for the amount of information that they're given in a private marketplace deal environment, where the buyer and the seller communicate ahead of time so that goals are very clearly communicated, and the seller can set up a private marketplace deal that has pricing that's kind of fixed for the buyer. And the buyer understands the screens that will be involved. Again, this is non-guaranteed, so nothing is saying that the ad will play on the screens that are included in the deal, but those would be the only screens that the ad could potentially play on. And we see one-to-one here because we can make these deals available to one specific brand or agency. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see one-to-many deals, because those are private marketplace deals that a publisher can make available to all that are looking in discovery mode, or to a few parties. And let's just head to the next slide. Okay, so two questions that have come up around these topics and that we had talked about a little bit beforehand. One is, why would a PMP versus working directly with the media owner be important, and why would a client wish to do this? And again, as I kind of mentioned before, there's always going to be work between a buyer and a seller, even in programmatic. Programmatic does not mean that the communication just goes away. So a PMP does involve working directly with the media owner from the buy side to, again, understand what those KPIs are, how much money should be spent on the campaign to reach those, any targeting or attribution that should be taken into account, which Dave is going to talk about shortly. It's all one and the same. And then the next one talks about remnant inventory. And I have to say, think of remnant inventory as like the ants and termites that an anteater picks up throughout its daily ventures. We are not that in out of home. I'd like to consider us more caviar. So we are limited in supply, and we have very premium screens that that buyers can run on. So again, remnant, that occurred largely in the digital world on the boundless like websites that, you know, can just be created and then create ad space that buyers mistakenly might run on. We don't have that in out of home. We have a set number of screens. They're very premium. Some run video, some run static, but in amazing locations and contexts, pointing to Christina's slide earlier. So if a buyer does say, hey, this is like a remnant strategy, we just have to have to have the conversation about the value of out of home. And we have not yet seen any race to the bottom type situation that was experienced in digital. And thanks to Christina and Dave on this call, as well as the OAAA and everybody really else involved in getting programmatic out there in the space, we are abiding by best practices that make sure we should be in good form moving forward.
Yeah, Stephanie, to actually just build on that, I couldn't agree more. From the agency perception, we definitely feel that digital out of home is actually the most premium inventory, because we are very well aware that if a seller is going to convert a printed or static board into a digital out of home asset, it's going to be able to monetize as much revenue as possible. So we definitely socialize that throughout our agencies and to our strategy teams to have that confidence in the medium.
Great. Well, thank you, Christina, and thank you, Stephanie. I thought that was fantastic. It really focused on two of the really inherent capabilities of programmatic, which are the flexibility afforded to the buyer, such as Christina and others, particularly around things like non-guaranteed, which makes a lot of sense for brands right now with the uncertainty that's temporarily existing in the world. And also the ability to buy across channel and see out of home alongside other media. I'm going to focus on another two core tenets, advanced targeting of audiences, and then what actually happens once you put the plan together. What do people do having been exposed to the ad? So the measurement component. Next slide, please. As Christina said, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit more on the two types of DSP which service our industry today. So on the left, number one, you're going to see a bunch of logos that you recognize, hopefully. On the left, you see the point solution or specialized DSPs that service just this industry. And then you see on the right, those omni-channel DSPs that have added out of home to the kind of omni-channel mix, every other programmatic media that exists. The next slide talks a little bit about the differences and benefits of those. As Christina says, one of the fundamental strengths that you get from those point solution specialized DSPs is that the planning suite, the UX for the buyer, for the marketer, is phenomenal. Everything makes sense. The language that's used, the conceits that are used are all tailor-made and specific for our industry and all of its idiosyncrasies. It's very easy to set campaigns up, makes a lot of sense. What you give up with that is that it's just out of home, and that's fine for a lot of campaigns, but many campaigns need a kind of omni-channel mix. Sometimes it's a smaller budget. And on the other side, for the omni-channels, of course, what you get here is an ability for the marketer to plan across everything. To kind of follow the user, really be kind of consumer and KPI focused, worry less about what's going on in each individual media. Everything is normalized across each. So campaign setup, targeting, optimization, measurement is equalized for everything. Everything's shareable, and typically those budgets are a wee bit bigger. What you give up in those is that you don't get, initially at least, that kind of easy to use, beautiful, this makes absolute sense in out of home. You get a lot of terms that perhaps don't make sense for our medium. That improves over time, of course, but to begin with, it can feel very different. And I've peppered the following slides with examples from each to kind of show you a little bit of difference. But let's start with kind of advanced targeting and what we're really trying to compare ourselves to, which is what was experienced in online advertising, particularly the cookie. Now, cookies really, I think first and foremost, enabled a really kind of slick, enjoyable user experience online. In other words, a great example is that you put your password into Facebook on a browser. When you return to it the next day, you just log in automatically. That sort of frictionless, effortless enjoyment of the internet is driven by cookies, or was driven by cookies. That also enables brands and advertisers to learn much about the user, because within that browsing experience, you can also learn where that individual, what have they clicked on, what have they seen. You start to build up an understanding of that person based upon their behavior online. And those behaviors are then be able to be bought and targeted by the marketer. And that kind of deterministic targeting has really driven online advertising. And it was a huge shift. For us, in our world, we have something that's analogous, and actually something which is probably even better, and that's location. Next slide, please. I think in many ways, location, where you go, is a better indicator of who you are than probably like what you look at online or your demography, or are you a millennial? I think those behaviors that you exhibit in the physical world really do a lot to help us understand who you are. And for the past few years, you know, whether it's DSPs or agencies like Christina's, or publishers like Clear Channels and Outfronts, etc., they've been kind of building their own understanding of audiences through location. And essentially how this works is you capture exposed device IDs around billboards or street furniture or transit inventory, whatever it is. And then over the next 30 days or 60 days, you look where else those device IDs have been. And you base that physical location, those locations, and you begin to build segments. You begin to say that these billboards over-index for these types of behaviors. And that's a very powerful thing for a buyer to be able to see and understand. If you go to the next slide, I think we have an example here of a BMO. Sorry, it's a wee bit on the small side. BMO aren't really a point solution DSP. They kind of made their name in mobile. So they have kind of mobile and out of home, things that exist, I suppose, in the physical world. But their ability to build audiences using mobile data is phenomenal. You can see here how the kind of mapping works around that. You can not just kind of build segments, but you can kind of target behaviors as well. You can do things like, you know, target ads outside competitive stores, or even like look at audiences that have been to competitive stores to try and change those behaviors in the future. The next slide, I think, excuse me, is an example of an omni-channel DSP. You can see it looks very different. This is a Mobi. The ability to target by location is included here, but less visual because of course it has to be normalized across everything else. Hopefully that begins to show you some of the differences from a UX perspective that you would come to expect. Next slide, please. So beyond targeting location, of course, you can target lots of other things. And Christina talked about those kind of advanced targeting capabilities. I think one of the key drivers for programmatic out of home is the ability to onboard first and third party audience segments into the physical world. The way that happens is you know, the same way that you would think about the cookies in online, you're able to kind of put geo-signatures on those users in the physical world. You see where they over-index, you begin to create maps where they over-index in the physical world. You then populate those maps with available inventory and you run campaigns. It really is analogous to everything that happens online. If you go to the next slide, you can kind of see, and again, another couple of screenshots, you can kind of see how, in this case, a BMO onboards those first party segments. And I think the next slide is probably an example of how a Mobi does it. So just to kind of get you used to those different user experiences. So you've used location, you've been able to onboard first party segments, third party segments, you've done other things which Christina was telling you about as well, like weather triggers, et cetera, and you've built a great plan. It's dynamic, it changes over time. What happens next? Like, what is the impact of this? What's the performance measurement? And performance and attribution is really a key part of what grew the internet as well. If you're a marketer, you don't just want to be able to see where your campaign goes. You want to be able to see the performance of every single dollar that you spent. And being able to see this on every single campaign, again, contributed to online's massive growth from an advertising perspective. What we call digital events. So somebody's online, they click on an ad, they put something in a shopping basket, they buy something. All of these conversions are kind of housed within a DSP for online, and they've been what's been used to kind of measure the success of a campaign for a long time. In addition, DSPs are also able to, either within their own platform or using third parties outside it, use those same atomic elements they use to measure this stuff to think about things like brand lift, TV tune in, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's the good news on the next slide. You can do all of that with out of home programmatically as well, literally all of it. The way that works is pretty much in the same way that the measurement works. Device IDs are passed through the bid stream to the DSPs. And essentially, the DSP then uses those atomic elements to be able to see that the person that was exposed to that Clear Channel billboard has now gone online and bought something. In addition, the omni-channel DSPs can also apply something called a device graph. So they can say that person that saw that Clear Channel board is also the person that we saw that mobile ad or that ad online. And you begin to get this holistic understanding of the impact of your advertising across all of those channels, which is, Christina said earlier, is part of the omni-channel mix. What is out-of-home's contribution to everything else? So programmatically, you can measure those digital events in the same way. Clicks are slightly different. There is a way to do that, but mainly we're talking about, I saw the ad, then what did I do? Post-view measures. Foot traffic's a big component as well, and many DSPs house that inside as well, so we can do that. Brand awareness, sales lift, all of this stuff is now contained within the DSPs, and you can measure all of these outcomes pretty much on every single campaign. And so we've gone from not really understanding the impact of out of home to not just seeing its impact alone, but seeing it as part of a wider mix, which is a phenomenal new way of thinking about our media. And this wasn't the case a couple of years ago. So it's a tremendous opportunity for us to see the contributions our media makes to all KPIs. It's very, very exciting. And the final slide from me, I think, is a little case study that tries to kind of pull in all of those little bits. And this actually, so Mark Bartholomew from Posterscope, this is one of his. He spoke on Tuesday. We have the same accent. So I'll try and do as good a job as he would of presenting this. This was one of his clients. As you all probably know, Dentsu bought Merkle a while ago. So Merkle had these things called M1 segments, really kind of crystallized view of audiences, etc. And so the question here was, could we onboard Merkle segments into the physical world? And if we could, how could we measure their effectiveness versus non-Merkle segments? So what we're able to do for this particular advertiser, we're able to onboard these M1 segments. We put geo-signatures on them. We're able to see crucially where they over-indexed in a number of markets, as well as where they under-indexed. And we ran campaigns in the over-indexing areas and the under-indexing areas. And you can kind of see for yourselves, I'm sure you've been sort of reading these stats whilst I've been talking. The lift for homepage visits, and we were firing pixels within the DSP in real time. So we're able to say, this person saw the ad there, they're part of that cohort, and now they've gone online and they're taking these actions. So the lift for the homepage visit, 2.5 times. The Merkle segment got 2.5 times the web page visits as the non-Merkle segment. And for arriving via search, it was 4.3 times bigger. So this proved a couple of things. Number one, it proved that Merkle segments are really great. So if you have an opportunity to buy them through Mark, do. But secondly, I think it proved that advanced targeting and the ability to measure attribution and performance isn't just doable, but it shows that out of home can compete, can do a job, and it's scalable and pretty easy to do. So very exciting, and I think we're going to see more of these types of campaigns across more agencies, more clients, and more verticals. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, guys. That was terrific. And so now we'll turn to some Q&A. We did have some questions come in, and anyone who does have questions now, this would be a good time to type them into the question bar, and we'll try to get to them over the next few minutes. So let me ask by starting with this question. It says, my job is as an AE, and it's to serve my agencies. How can I best do that using programmatic? What's my elevator pitch?
I guess I'll
Would like
take
to
that.
take that. Okay.
I'll take that. So the elevator pitch for using programmatic, and again, I think it kind of goes back to some of the things we talked about. I mean, buying out of home has tremendous value, but programmatic actually enables us to enhance flexibility and targetability. So I think it's really about understanding what your client's KPIs are, and then determining which transaction types actually going to meet those requirements. So I think that once you understand that, it's really, again, using those guidelines and guardrails that agencies set for us to determine and kind of arrive at like a standardized approach and sensible approach to make sure that whichever transaction type they choose, it's really making sure that they're delivering on the KPIs.
Great, thank you, that's great. Someone's asking, currently, are most of the out-of-home or digital out-of-home programmatic deals non-guaranteed or guaranteed? Any sense on that?
There's actually no AAA survey about that rather recently. The majority are non-guaranteed.
Guaranteed.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Great. Sort of on the same line with that, are the majority of the digital out-of-home buys open or PMP? And do you have a sense of what, if it's 50-50 or what the breakdown might be?
I could give you a sense from the, go on, Christina.
You know, I have to say it really depends. I mean, every agency is different. We actually have a really robust PMP offering because that's just sort of the positioning that we've taken within our agency. That being said, while we do have that, the open exchange still really delivers a tremendous amount of value in terms of scale. So there's actually oftentimes we're going to see a buy where it's a direct buy, PMP buy, and then we might even sprinkle in some open exchange. So we are actually using them in combination with one another.
And I was just going to add to that from an omni-channel perspective. So Place Exchange is typically connected to the omni-channel DSPs, and I think that's an emerging part of the spend. I think a lot of work still needs to happen on the front end of those omni-channel DSPs, because that type of open exchange, we're talking about ads that could be delivered to mobile or online or CTV, and so there's a little bit of work on the front end now. Amobi is doing a lot of it, MediaMath's doing a lot of it. But I think for the majority from an omni-channel perspective is PMP based.
Yeah, and Dave, just to build on that, in our division and our team within OMG, we actually evaluate the omnichannel DSPs, and we work very collaboratively with the omnichannel traders. So it's really an excellent partnership that we have. And we have seen some great headway with the omnichannel DSPs in terms of those targeting. And as I kind of mentioned before, it's audience and supply, but it's also those physical world targeting parameters that cannot be ignored when we're really looking to activate out of home.
Well, Christina and Dave, go ahead. Go ahead, Stephanie.
From a publisher perspective too, keeping an eye on what type of deal it is. Is it exchange? Is it PMP? Is it guaranteed? That's a way that your ad ops team and the sales team can work closely together to make sure that you understand what your pipeline looks like, because you could have a PMP running that stops and then you might see a drop in revenue because of that. So just something to be paying attention to.
Great. Sort of keeping in line with that question, another person asked, how well is the out-of-home industry doing integrating into the omni-channel ecosystem, and what are the best ways to do it? How is it working most successfully, and how do we even do a better job at integrating into those omni-channel buys? Thoughts on that?
Well, why don't I start? Because I think Christina could probably talk better about what's the best kind of profile of campaign that.
Right.
But the first thing you need to do is you need to get the omni-channel DSPs in our space. And here's the good news.
And who are they? Give us a name, David. Tell us a couple of names that we would know or should know.
I had a slide further up, but the Trade Desk. I mean, the Trade Desk is one of the de facto agency tools. Lots of agencies use it. MediaMath, Verizon, of course, Roku. There are, a growing number, and there are some big names not yet in, but are making moves to arrive. And so that's the first thing that you need. You need the DSPs in it, because if the DSPs are in it, suddenly the buyer at an agency or a client direct can now see out of home as part of this wider ecosystem, and so they can buy it. So that's the first part. There's a lot of education and evangelizing that needs to happen after that as a kind of new and nascent media, but the first bit is the kind of key component.
Great. All right. Well, you're talking about those big name DMPs. Someone's asking the DV360, which is, I guess, Google's platform, this person says doesn't seem that they are officially supporting out-of-home buys at this time, yet they are seeing out-of-home buys come through. What's happening there, and what can the industry do to get more aligned with, say, the Google's platform?
Well, I think you'd have to ask somebody from DV360.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's clear that they are interested in the space and have done a number of pilots that have been talked about. But yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to ask somebody from them in terms of what their thoughts are. But we're hopeful, confident they'll arrive in our space soon.
Yeah, I have to say, years ago when programmatic was just starting, or whenever there was attention to out of home by Google, a lot of people in out of home started to get a little scared or nervous, thinking, Google's just going to come in and buy us and everything's going to be so different. And I think that it's a really great compliment to the people in our space these days, where we've really grown, and we now look at Google's interest in our space as a really good thing. They represent yeah, a lot of opportunity from this omni-channel perspective, and there's a lot for us to learn from them and vice versa. So
yeah, I think that's right. What's happens when IADs are taken out of the mix?
I think it might have been IDFA, which is the whole Apple identifier.
Oh, probably that's what they meant. Yeah, but
so, you know, people might disagree with me on this, but, you know, there have been a lot of times over the course of ad tech progression where it's like the sky is falling because there's a new privacy measure that's been put into place by either a tech provider such as Apple or through the government, such as GDPR over in Europe, or CCPA here in the US. You know what? Like every time that's come around, everybody's grouped together and figured out a way to move forward, and it benefits the consumer and it benefits us as an industry. So I think we'll be okay. But curious to know, Christina and Dave, what you think.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that's a great response. But I think ultimately we would all agree and align on the fact that, you know, consumer privacy is going to be at the utmost of our concerns on anything we do to activate, because that's really going to be important to our brands, right? So I agree with you, and I do think if there are any implications that could potentially like reduce the access and the ability to gain some type of this data in terms of mobile device IDs or what have you. But right now, I think it's a matter of trying to determine the impacts and implications as they come, as opposed to forecasting and projecting, like Stephanie kind of said. Sometimes we get really concerned about what the impacts are going to be, and we end up realizing that as long as we are compliant with guidelines, we're okay.
I'll do a quick plug for my boss, Ari Buchalter, because he actually wrote a great article on this a couple of weeks ago. We don't know if they're going away. They might not. You know, the same with cookies, by the way. What's true for us will be true for online as well. But Ari's point in a nutshell, and you should Google it because he states it better than I will now, is that if we do move away from a more kind of deterministic way of thinking about measurement to a more probabilistic way, then out of home is laughing, because the power of the context of the physical world is far superior. Location's far superior to anything that exists online. So to my panelists' points as well, I agree. I think however this shakes out, we'll have plenty of notice, and I think we'll be perfectly positioned for it.
that's really a great point. And Ari also did a follow-up thought leader on the OAAA blog last week as well. So go to the OAAA site and read Ari's terrific piece there. And it really does illuminate some of these issues. Let me ask this question, which is similar. I mean, you've kind of answered it a bit, but I think it does ask a slightly different question. And it says, looking at the likely trends in data and privacy, like the California ballot measure coming up, which focuses more on consumer control, does programmatic buying benefit from this trend? Or will programmatic be frustrated by it? And I think they mean out of home. And I think you've already said that, you know, we're laughing, we're smiling, but specific, I guess, to programmatic, you know, does it help, do you think?
Yeah, even going back to the whole remnant conversation, like programmatic began as a transaction type over a decade ago. So it's still pretty young compared to our standard way of buying and selling media. And there's been a lot of progress in terms of cleaning it up. And so you know, these can only just help us. Yeah, it might be some bad actors, if you will, might take an immediate hit. It might be frustrating to everybody involved as we just change what we're used to. But overall, it's something that's definitely surmountable and will make us better.
I think that's a great response, Stephanie. Sure.
Yes. So this question goes back to Tuesday's session. And so the three of you may not be able to answer because it says that Ian Dallimore mentioned that Lamar uses 4 to 5 main DSPs. And they asked, do you know if those DSPs are omni-channel DSPs? And and maybe only Ian can answer that question, but let me ask it more broadly. Are the out-of-home companies, do you believe the out-of-home companies are starting to work with multiple DSPs? And how do we do that? How do we make sure that everyone's sort of singing from the same prayer book, if you will, so that there is commonality, consistency across the DSPs?
Well, we could text him
Yeah, we could text him. We'll ask him after. Ian, if you're watching, send us a note. Tell us.
He is watching. But I think I know the answer. He works with a combination. You know, he's connected to both Omni channels and point solution DSPs.
And probably multiple, because at the end of the day, agencies are working with multiple ones as well. So we will work across omni-channel, and then we use dedicated channels. So,
well, Stephanie, what's happening at Outfront?
Oh, well, I was just going to clarify too. A lot of publishers at this time integrate with SSP, supply side platforms like Place Exchange or Vistar or Omni, what have you. And it's those SSPs that then integrate to the DSPs that tap into the supplier's inventory. So there's typically two middlemen involved in there. And so largely it's, you know, up to Dave and his team, for example, to determine which DSPs can then access suppliers that they have onboarded.
Great. This question comes in from our dear friend out there. Hello, Jack Sullivan. How does programmatic square that screens are measured by different audit companies, and how do they vary in accuracy of impressions? That is a classic Jack question. Great question.
Could you actually repeat the front end? And in fact, I saw a Jack question come up, and he was very concerned about the lack of artwork on some of our backdrops.
Oh, well, there's that too.
I'm seeing his questions pop up.
Stephanie,
I think you've got a great excuse for yours.
Thanks.
It's how does programmatic square that screens are measured by differing audit companies, basically, and how do the vary in these varies of measures square with accuracy of impressions?
I could take a go at that. So look, I think the programmatic marketer is agnostic. Place Exchange as an SSP, we are agnostic. We have a product we call, well, a process we call PX Clear, which is a very rigorous way of onboarding new supply. And things like audience measurement is a key component of that. Obviously, GeoPath is already accredited, and the majority of people that we work with use GeoPath. But if you're also using video analytics, camera analytics, or something like this, we take that too. I think the world is changing. We are moving away from kind of, again, I'll use those two words, probabilistic to more deterministic understanding of audience. And we should be open to all of them. And certainly the digital buyer is open to all of those things. So it's not a problem as long as you're able to present the supply with your hand on your heart and say, this is in fact the audience or the closest understanding of audience that we can represent.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the transparency need for DSPs, because I kind of view DSP as tech. I view myself and my team as the experts. And to that end, we're experts on analyzing audience measurement, whether you're using GeoPath or not. You know, we want to be able to make sure we understand how we're arriving at the impression multiplier. And we, of course, assume and expect the impression multiplier to be present. So again, that's where the transparency comes into play, because we actually analyze every network by network. Each has their own separate value proposition, content considerations, placement considerations, screen size, video, audio, none. So it's really imperative that the agency kind of takes that lead in understanding exactly what they're planning on buying.
Good, great.
And also from a publisher perspective, it really is like there's nothing that will benefit anybody from using data that isn't clean and trustworthy, because in many cases we are developing these brand new relationships with buyers who haven't experienced out of home before. So we want them to have a great experience and develop that trust, which takes time, and it also takes proven results from their campaigns. So there's just nothing to be won by going in with impression counts that don't make sense or aren't vetted by a trusted partner.
That's great. Stephanie, I think you covered this a little bit earlier when you were talking about sort of factors to consider when building a campaign. But Steve Riddle asks or says, as I was driving into New York this morning, I was captivated by video billboards on the 9A, but I was driving and could not really give them great attention or a lot of attention. Are there considerations given to the different digital formats and the ability to pay attention and the various dwell times. Is that a
Yes,
factor?
and I don't think that was an out front digital roadside billboard if it was running video, because that's not allowed. Across the US, there are regulations. Video should not be playing in a roadside environment of that nature. But hopefully you were captivated by a digital board that had some static creative.
Let's hope it was that.
per venue type, there's definitely consideration by the publisher of dwell time, so that the ad slots that are available to buyers will make sure that whoever's viewing gets enough in there so they can follow up. Usually there's a KPI. We want to make sure that they see it. So screens in different venues have different dwell times, and that will have a lot of factors into play in terms of what goes up there and how the viewer can engage. But curious, Christina and Dave, what you would like.
Yeah, those are excellent points, but I'm going to hope and assume that the board was able to post that. And what gives us great confidence, if something is measured by a third party like GeoPath, dwell time, visibility has all been factored in to the spot level impression. So we actually have a lot of confidence in that visibility and the impression associated with that spot, again, if they've been audited properly.
Yeah. So how has or how can programmatic drive out-of-home back into the marketing mix post-COVID? Is this happening anywhere? Is programmatic helping us get back from the COVID pandemic? And are we seeing any results in that regard at this point?
I mean, I can comment on that. I think in the same way that we've got this muscle memory of working from home, being flexible, we're on Zoom all the time. I think the inherent flexibility that we talked about, of particularly buying non-guaranteed, right? Not having to spend 2 weeks negotiating with a media owner if you suddenly had to pause a campaign. And then the inherent ability to target the performance, so understand where that dollar's going. I think for many brands, programmatic has been the avenue back into the medium. And certainly we're seeing that as an SSP. We've been able to secure some really big budgets, and I know others like us have. And so, I actually think that we're sort of learning this muscle memory, maybe 12 months faster than we would have done ordinarily.
That's a good point. Yeah, very good point.
No, I agree with you. I think that digital out of home at large and programmatic really flexed its muscle during COVID-19, and we're kind of considering it the on-ramp to really get reinvestment back. And I know that there's been some recent reports very bullish on digital out of home spending for next year and programmatic transactions. So we're really excited. Again, there's been a lot more inventory that's become programmatically enabled recently. And again, that scale is really, really critical, and we really look for that.
It's also a reminder of the value add of out of home, just as a differentiator when being accessed programmatically versus other media, is that we are quite unique in that there's no context around us typically. Like a billboard is just dedicated to the ad. It doesn't have additional content alongside it, like if it's a commercial during television broadcast, or if it's an ad online that's next to news text. I think that people being home for such extended periods of time kind of get wear out from seeing ads alongside constant news about COVID or whatever else is going on in the world. So when you step out and you see an ad that's just playing by itself as an ad without any extra context around it, there's a refreshing nature to that, and really helps, we go from the idea of brand safety to, brand kind of prominence and actual enjoyment.
Yeah, and we certainly see that with the outdoor formats for sure, but I also think that there's a ton of content specifically with the digital place-based networks. But what's actually really unique is a lot of that content has been developed and customized specifically for that venue or for the experience or the behavior of the consumer in that environment. So I think it really just resonates. It's kind of like clean and fresh content, to your point, Steph.
And I think on this question too, what we're finding and seeing is that actually programmatic has helped with the recovery of the out-of-home space, because so many national brands in particular are really holding their dollars and they're making last-minute changes and decisions. And because you can move so quickly with programmatic, they are using out-of-home because of programmatic to quickly come in and out and make those sort of quick decisions that a lot of them are making right now because of the pandemic.
Yeah, inherent
which is
safeguards
great.
for sure.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. From an agency perspective, so I guess this is for you, Christina, what criteria do you use to elevate or evaluate DSPs? Or do you find that some DSPs are better suited to certain situations and others are better suited to different situations?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, kind of as we presented, it's a lot of that targeting capability. And that's where, I tried to highlight that the single channel or dedicated channel DSPs, they're really tremendous in terms of targeting for digital out of home. And I think that we're seeing, again, a lot of headway being made on the omni-channel DSP. So it's really about understanding what the needs are of the campaign and the targeting requirements. And then we would select a DSP that will meet those requirements. We don't really build campaigns around a DSP's functionality. It's actually the other way around.
Oh, actually, that's a really good thing good point to make. That's really interesting. So Stephen Riddle just wanted to clarify, Stephanie, that he said video billboard, and it was certainly not streaming video. So it was a static ad that he saw today on the 9A. One more question.
We're all gonna have to find out what this board is.
Yeah, I know. We're all gonna have to go take a picture.
Or what ads is running to make it so interesting.
Yeah, well, somebody did a great job because we're talking about their ad today. We need to go take a picture.
We're seeing 9A all over Twitter.
Yeah, send pictures today. Put it on Instagram and Twitter. So one person asks, so the OAAA has an automation and programmatic committee. Can you kind of tell the difference or explain the difference between what is automation and what is programmatic?
Classic question.
Yeah.
It is a classic question.
Anyone want to take a stab?
Yeah, automation just takes out the grunt work from, putting together these IOs and constantly going back and forth between the different parties. Everything happens in a single UI, and this is really nice. And I know Christina can definitely attest for her team to happen in the out-of-home space, but also when the buyers are dealing with multiple media at the same time, to have everything just in one platform is a huge help. So that's automation. And then programmatic really has the real-time decisioning involved. That's where there is for sure an SSP, for sure a DSP, and it really moves away from just an automated transaction type, which could be directly from the agency or buyer to the media owner, to something that's a little bit more evolved and factors a few different types of thinking and decisioning into the funnel. That would be my take.
But I agree, Stephanie. That was an excellent response in terms of it's really about the real-time decisioning, and then the bidding opportunity are probably key differentiators.
Yeah, perfect. Excellent answer. Well, that's great, guys. Thank you for taking such a great lightning round of questions and answers today. Really, really great response, and thank you for your presentation too. It was really wonderful. Before we leave today, I just want to go around the room one more time, or the screen one more time, and say, Christina, Stephanie, Dave, if there was one thing you want the listeners today to take home with them and to remember, what's the one thing you want them to remember, Christina?
Well, it's funny. I actually said this at the New York Ad Club this year, and I think it's really imperative that every agency and every seller develops a programmatic strategy, because this is not going away. It has the ability to enhance our business on both sides and to embrace it. But of course, there's a lot of education, and I hope that webinar 1 and 2 were really helpful there. But again, it's a huge opportunity. Embrace it. But really start to gear up and build a strategy around it for your company. Again, both buyers and sellers. All
about strategy, absolutely. Stephanie, what do you say?
I mentioned this in the Programmatic and Automation Committee, actually, a week or two ago. Less talk, more do, and that's DOOH. And really, it's just a reminder. It's taken us a lot to get to this point. I understand that programmatic seems very nascent still and out of home, but everyone on this call and a lot of people involved in the industry have been at it relentlessly for, I don't know, the past 7 years. So it's something that we're all consciously working on and toward. It's not going to take away from what's currently in place. It's only going to enhance our space and make it that much more accessible to anybody who thinks that they'd like to run an ad on a billboard, but maybe in the past didn't really know how. So there's still a lot of work to do, to Christina's point, and we'll keep at it.
Let's do it. Dave, what do you say?
I'll echo all of it. This isn't some future facing thing. This has been going on at scale for a while. This is happening. It enables us to finally take our rightful place alongside other media to prove the value of our medium. And if you're selling to clients, ask them the question, what are you doing programmatically? What DSPs do you use? Start that conversation. This is happening now. And there's tons of resources. And so get involved.
Yeah, and I just want to add one more comment. You know, having 20 years of traditional out-of-home experience, programmatic can seem cumbersome, complicated, and I have to say, honestly, it's really in the nomenclature alone. So once you get past that, it starts to, the pieces of the puzzle come together, the value proposition becomes really clear. And again, we intend to continue to transact both programmatically, through those various tactics, but then also very much directly as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you, three. Thank you to our three panelists from Tuesday. The series has been terrific. I hope our listeners have gotten a lot out of it. I think they have, and I hope they've learned a lot. I'm sure they have. A recording of the webinar today will be available later on, as well as Tuesday's webinar. So thank you all for joining us, and please have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.